A mountain man's ingenuity saved his life and the lives of many others. But the invention that made his cabin nearly impenetrable didn't start with triumph. It began with tragedy. After losing a friend to the wilderness, he dedicated his life to building a shelter no grizzly bear could breach. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you love survival stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal a hidden frontier discovery you won't want to miss. The year was 1837, and the Rocky Mountains stretched before Samuel Bridger like an endless, snow-covered expanse, harsh and unforgiving. His cabin, a modest shelter by most standards, stood firm against the elements, but its security was anything but certain. Samuel had learned the mountain's ways. How the cold crept under your skin, how the wolves could appear without a sound, how the grizzlies ruled the land. Still, he never expected that one of them would come so close. That fateful day, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Samuel stood at his window, watching the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't the wind that sent a shiver down his spine, it was the stillness that preceded it. When a storm was coming, the air always held a strange quality. It seemed to carry a warning, but Samuel had learned not to trust his instincts in the mountains. Yet this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He turned away from the window and grabbed his rifle. It was a tool he had used many times before, not for sport, but for survival. The door of his cabin creaked as he opened it, stepping into the crisp air. A fresh layer of snow had blanketed the ground, and his boots crunched through the powder with each step. The world around him felt suspended in time, the mountains holding their breath. His attention snapped to the trail of claw marks in the snow, leading away from the cabin and into the thick trees. The prints were unmistakable. A grizzly had passed through. Samuel's heart quickened as the sounds of the wilderness returned to his ears, his mind racing. A grizzly in the area was a constant threat, but it wasn't the bear itself that terrified him. It was the vulnerability of his cabin. The logs that held his shelter together, sturdy though they seemed, would not withstand the full force of a determined bear. His mind flashed to his partner, John Hoffman, who had been killed months earlier by a grizzly while checking trap lines. It was in that moment of loss that Samuel swore he would never be so unprepared again. As Samuel crouched by the door, carefully inspecting the marks in the snow, he knew that the time had come for him to think differently about survival. If he was going to live in this unforgiving place, he would need more than just skill with a rifle. He needed to make his shelter stronger, impervious to whatever nature threw at him. But first, he had to survive the night. The following days were filled with a sense of dread, as if the mountains themselves were aware of Samuel's growing anxiety. He couldn't shake the image of the grizzly's massive paws pressing into the snow near his cabin. Samuel's thoughts drifted to the one thing that had changed the course of his life: John Hoffman's death. His partner's body had been left on the hillside near the creek, the brutal reality of mountain life finally cementing in Samuel's mind. It wasn't just the wilderness that killed men, it was the ignorance of its dangers, the failure to adapt. The night after the bear's visit, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't the storm that kept him awake. His thoughts churned on his partner's death, the cabin's weaknesses, and the overwhelming urge to find a solution. In the darkness, an idea began to form. If the grizzly had found a way to breach his shelter, what could he do to prevent it from happening again? There had to be a way to make the cabin stronger, to protect himself from the dangers lurking outside. Samuel had spent years trapping in the Rockies, surviving through sheer determination and instinct. But this was different. He had seen how the grizzly tested the walls of his cabin, how it circled the door and clawed at the corners. He had observed the weaknesses that were easy to overlook, a slight gap between the logs here, a loose door frame there. Every part of the cabin structure, no matter how sturdy it seemed, held a flaw. Samuel's mind raced as he thought of ways to fix them, to reinforce every corner and joint. The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became with the idea. He had never considered himself an inventor, but now, in the silence of his cabin, he knew he had to be. The problem wasn't just the bear, it was every other threat the wilderness could throw at him. He couldn't just patch up his cabin and hope for the best. He needed to make it untouchable. And so began his obsession. Samuel spent the next few weeks visiting nearby trappers and their cabins, inspecting their structures, learning from their experiences. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain. The way things were done couldn't be the way they should be done. With each visit, he learned more. He saw doors ripped off their hinges, logs splintered at the corners. He listened to stories of trappers who had survived bear attacks, taking mental notes on the weaknesses their cabins had exposed. Slowly, Samuel began to piece together a blueprint for his cabin, one that would make it truly impervious to the wilderness. But he also knew that building such a structure would take time. Time he couldn't afford to waste. In the quiet of his cabin, Samuel made a vow. No more half measures. He would build a shelter that no bear could tear apart, and in doing so, he would change the course of frontier survival forever. By late spring, Samuel had become a man consumed with purpose. His mind, once filled with the constant rhythms of trapping and surviving, was now dominated by thoughts of cabin construction. The sight of each cabin he visited, each failure and weakness, only fueled his obsession. He had seen enough to know that no matter how hard men worked, or how much they had, their cabins were vulnerable. Every log that cracked or door that splintered was a reminder of the very real dangers they faced. Dangers that didn't just come from the land, but from the creatures that called it home. Samuel had always prided himself on his ability to adapt to the wilderness. He was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to loss. Yet in the quiet after his partner's death, he had come to realize that there was no part of mountain life more dangerous than the delusion of safety. His cabin was only as strong as the materials it was made from, and those materials were not enough. In the weeks that followed, he spent his time collecting information. He sought out more than just trappers, visiting small outposts and trading posts to talk to carpenters, builders, and anyone who might have insight into making a structure that could withstand the trials of the Rocky Mountains. While many thought him eccentric, an uneducated trapper obsessing over construction, they couldn't deny the practicality of his determination. It was in St. Louis, at the end of a long trade trip, that Samuel had the breakthrough he had been searching for. He spent hours in a warehouse, watching the carpenters work. As they moved logs, reinforced door frames, and built sturdy foundations, Samuel's mind clicked into place. It wasn't about brute strength. It was about how forces were distributed, how the weight of a building, its connections, its joints, were designed to hold together under stress. He didn't have a formal education in architecture, but he could see the way the pieces fit together, the way simple techniques could be adapted to make a structure stronger than it was ever meant to be. He returned to the wilderness with a head full of new ideas and a pack full of unusual supplies: square nails, iron brackets, and a draw knife. Tools and materials he had seen used by professional builders were now in his possession. Some might have called him foolish for spending his profits on these supplies, but Samuel knew better. The price of those materials was nothing compared to the cost of another bear attack. The journey back to the mountains felt longer than it had ever been before. He wasn't thinking about the beaver pelts or the trade goods he'd sold. His thoughts were consumed with his plans for the new cabin, the new life that would come from building something indestructible. The mountains loomed before him like they always did, but this time they seemed to be waiting for him to make a decision. Would he accept the risk of the wilderness and its dangers, or would he fight back with everything he had? The site Samuel chose for his new cabin was far removed from the familiar paths of other trappers. Most men, he knew, preferred to build near water, where the streams provided an easy supply of fish, water, and nearby game. But Samuel had no interest in convenience. He wanted safety. The rise in the land, 50 yards from the creek, was not the easiest place to build, but it offered something far more important: visibility. From this spot, he could see any threat long before it reached his cabin. He wasn't willing to trust the land alone to protect him. He would create his own defense. Samuel's first task was the foundation. He dug a trench around the cabin's perimeter, filling it with rocks to create a solid base that would keep the structure from shifting over time. He knew that most cabins in the area simply rested on the ground, and that settling logs were one of the major causes of long-term instability. The trench would keep his cabin level, preventing the logs from shifting, and add an additional layer of defense against flooding. The construction of the walls was the next challenge. Samuel didn't just pick any logs he could find. He spent weeks selecting only the straightest, thickest, most uniform logs he could find. He rejected any tree that wasn't perfectly suited for the job. Most trappers would have accepted any tree available, but Samuel understood that a crooked log would leave gaps that bears or weather could exploit. He also stripped the bark from each log with painstaking care, knowing that the irregularities in the bark would create spaces for moisture to enter and for the structure to weaken over time. The logs, stripped down to their bare core, would fit together perfectly, leaving no room for pests, weather, or predators. It was in the corners where Samuel's real innovation would take shape. The traditional log cabins of the time used simple notches at the corners, a fast way to join logs together, but one that created weaknesses in the structure. Samuel had seen how bears could exploit these notches, prying logs apart to gain access. He wasn't content with tradition. Instead, he extended each log past the corner by 2 feet, creating overlapping extensions. The logs were pinned together with iron nails, which he had learned to use in St. Louis. This technique distributed the stress evenly across the logs, eliminating any weak points. For the chinking between the logs, Samuel didn't rely on the traditional moss or mud used by most mountain men. He created a unique mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin, which he had boiled into a thick paste. This compound would not only insulate the cabin against the harsh mountain winters, but would also make the structure impervious to the elements. As he packed the chinking into the spaces between the logs, Samuel could see the cabin beginning to take shape, a fortress of wood and stone, stronger than any that had come before. He worked tirelessly day after day as the summer months stretched on. The work was grueling, the logs heavy and unyielding, but Samuel's determination never faltered. He knew that his life, and perhaps the lives of others, depended on the success of this project. As the walls went up, Samuel's confidence grew. He had started with a simple dream of safety. Now, as he stood back to survey his work, he realized that he was creating something far more valuable: a legacy, a cabin that could not only withstand the wilderness, but could stand the test of time. As the cabin's walls rose higher, Samuel knew that the most critical component of his new shelter was still to come: the door. Most mountain cabins used simple doors made of thin planks or hastily assembled wooden frames, sometimes hung on leather hinges or crude wooden pegs. Samuel's door would be different. It needed to be not just a barrier, but a shield, something that could withstand the force of a grizzly bear's claws or the prying hands of a determined man. He spent a week selecting the right timber, looking for dense, straight-grained wood that would stand the test of time and the weight of a bear's strength. With careful precision, Samuel began shaping each plank, honing them with his draw knife until they fit together with immaculate perfection. Each board was nearly 3 inches thick, strong enough to resist force, but light enough to allow him to maneuver it without exhausting himself. While most trappers would have made do with a basic design, Samuel's vision for his door extended far beyond the norm. He created a tongue and groove joint for each plank, ensuring the pieces interlocked seamlessly. The door's weight would be substantial, nearly 90 pounds, but it would be nearly impossible for any animal, or even a person with tools, to break through it. But that wasn't enough. To reinforce the door's strength, Samuel added iron brackets in an X pattern across its interior, bolting them into place with square-cut nails. He could already picture it in his mind, a door that was part of the wall, so solid it could bear the weight of the entire cabin. The hinges were an innovation all their own. Where a standard hinge would be nailed into the surface of the doorframe, Samuel mortised them into both the door and the frame, creating a recess for the hinges to sit. The nails were hammered through the logs and clinched over on the other side, creating a nearly indestructible joint that would prevent any bear from tearing the door off its hinges. But Samuel didn't stop there. He designed a lock unlike any other in the wilderness. The common method among trappers was to use a simple wooden bar that dropped into brackets on the inside of the door. Samuel's lock would be different. He built a secondary system, a heavy wooden beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets mounted into the door and into a mortise cut into the wall log. This lock couldn't be bypassed from the outside. No one could break into the cabin unless they had knowledge of the secret mechanism that controlled it. It was a design born out of necessity, but it felt almost like an art form to Samuel. His cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a symbol of defiance, a structure that would not only protect him from bears and harsh weather, but could withstand any threat that came his way. As he stepped back to admire his work, the door gleamed in the afternoon sun. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, the weight of his dedication, his frustration, and his grief over John Hoffman's death. This door was more than just wood and iron. It was a testament to his survival. It was his final line of defense against the wilderness, and he knew he had created something that no grizzly bear could tear apart. With the door complete, Samuel began to focus on the final details, those that would make the cabin livable through the harshest winters and secure through the most violent storms. As the summer days began to wane, Samuel turned his attention to the roof, the final component that would complete his fortress. A roof might seem simple to most, but in the wilderness it was a matter of life or death. The standard cabins of the era had crude roofs made from logs, bark, and sod, and while they offered some protection, they were leaky and could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or rain. Samuel knew better. His roof would be something that would endure, a testament to his painstaking attention to detail. He began by selecting the right logs for the ridge poles, thick, sturdy logs, nearly 8 inches in diameter. These would form the backbone of the roof, bearing the weight of the entire structure above. Samuel notched the ridge poles carefully, securing them to the top of the cabin's walls. Then he spaced the poles 18 inches apart, tighter than typical roof designs, so the weight would be more evenly distributed across the structure. Most trappers used whatever logs they could find, but Samuel chose only the best. The tighter spacing would provide a stronger foundation for the planks that would follow. Next, Samuel laid down split planks over the ridge poles. Each plank was shaved flat on one side, and the planks were placed in overlapping layers like shingles. With each layer, Samuel ensured that no gaps remained. The overlapping design would keep out the rain and snow that had plagued so many cabins before. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles with wooden pegs, making sure each one was secure and positioned to prevent any leaks. But the true brilliance of Samuel's roof lay in what he added next, layers upon layers of protection. Over the planks he laid birch bark, a waterproof material that would provide a second layer of defense against the elements. Birch bark was flexible, resilient, and most importantly, waterproof, making it the perfect material for the job. But Samuel wasn't satisfied with just birch bark. He spread his clay horsehair resin mixture across the bark, sealing the roof's surface and ensuring no water would seep through. The resin hardened into a tough waterproof layer, fusing the bark to the planks below it, and creating an impenetrable barrier. Finally, Samuel added sod to the top of the roof, a natural insulator that would help regulate the temperature inside the cabin during the brutal mountain winters. As the grass took root, it created a living roof, a final touch that provided insulation and protection. The weight of the sod would also help keep the roof in place during heavy winds or snowstorms. When Samuel stepped back and looked at the completed roof, he knew it would survive anything the wilderness threw at it. The layers of wood, bark, resin, and sod created a roof that was impervious to the elements, fire-resistant, waterproof, and insulated against the cold. It was a roof that would keep the warmth inside the cabin and the dangers of the outside world at bay. With the roof complete, Samuel's cabin was almost finished. The structure he had created was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress, an unyielding monument to his obsession with survival. He could now rest easy, knowing that he had built something that no animal, no storm, and no enemy could break. And yet, as he stood at the threshold of his creation, Samuel knew that this was only the beginning. The true test of his cabin would come in the winter months, when the blizzards would rage outside and the grizzlies would return. But for now, the cabin stood strong, a silent sentinel against the wilderness. By the time autumn began to show its colors, Samuel had completed his fortress. His cabin, with its reinforced walls, impenetrable door, and fortified roof, stood firm against the mountain winds. But while the work was done, Samuel knew that no amount of planning or construction could truly prove the worth of his creation. It would only be tested when the storm came. The real test was how it would hold up against the brutal forces of nature, the wilderness, and the dangers lurking in the surrounding forests. The first sign that winter was on its way came with the gusting winds. The air turned sharp, and the sky began to darken earlier with each passing day. Samuel watched the sky carefully, for he knew how fast storms could move in these parts. With a gut feeling that something was coming, he doubled his preparations. He gathered more firewood, checked his traps, and made sure every corner of the cabin was ready for the long season ahead. The first snowstorm hit on a Friday evening. It arrived quietly, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. At first it was a light dusting, the kind that would easily be swept away with a breeze. But Samuel knew that this was only the beginning. Soon enough, the snow began to fall more heavily, swirling in thick, blinding sheets. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the temperature plummeted. Within a few hours, the snow was over a foot deep, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. Samuel stoked the fire in his stone fireplace, the warmth from the flames spreading through the cabin. But even with the heat, he knew that his shelter would soon be put to the test. As night fell, the snow kept coming. Samuel settled in with his rifle nearby, staying alert. He knew that the wilderness was at its most dangerous during storms. Bears, wolves, and other creatures sought shelter from the snow, but their instincts were still sharp. As he stared into the flickering firelight, he heard something, soft but unmistakable, a scratching sound, followed by a low growl. A chill ran down his spine. He knew exactly what it was. A bear had come, drawn by the scent of his cabin and the warmth within. Samuel moved silently to the window, peering through a small slit in the wall. There, in the swirling snow, he saw the hulking shape of a grizzly, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the fresh snow. It was circling the cabin, testing the walls, the door, and the corners. His heart pounded in his chest, but Samuel didn't move. He watched intently, studying the bear's every movement. The bear was methodical, sniffing the air and pushing at the door, just as it had done before. But this time there was a difference. The door held firm. The corners showed no signs of weakness. The walls stood resolute against the force of the grizzly's testing. For what seemed like hours, the bear circled the cabin, pushing, testing, but never breaking through. Samuel's breath slowed as he realized something extraordinary. His cabin was holding up. The structure that he had poured so much of himself into, The fortress he had built from the ground up was standing its ground against the most dangerous force in the wilderness. The bear eventually grew frustrated and wandered off, disappearing into the snowstorm. Samuel stayed at the window for a long while, watching the storm rage outside, listening to the wind howl through the trees. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment of peace. His cabin had survived its first true test, and it had passed with flying colors. He had built something that could withstand the wilderness, something that could protect him. But Samuel knew this was only the beginning. The grizzly would return, and the real test would come in the months ahead, when the snow piled higher and the cold seeped deeper into the bones of the mountain. Samuel wasn't naive enough to think that this storm would be the last of his trials. He'd created a fortress, but the wilderness always had a way of testing the limits of even the most well-laid plans. Winter set in with all its fury. As the days grew shorter and the temperature dropped, Samuel spent most of his time indoors, watching the storm rage outside, tending to the fire, and making sure his supplies were in order. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that the long winter would test both him and his cabin, but there was a strange peace that came with knowing his home was now his fortress. Despite the security of the cabin, Samuel couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led him here. His partner, John Hoffman, had died in the same mountains that Samuel now called home. The pain of that loss had been the seed of his obsession with building the perfect cabin. But in building it, Samuel had found a deeper purpose. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was also preserving the memory of a friend and, in a way, ensuring that future trappers and men of the wilderness would never suffer the same fate. The news of Samuel's indestructible cabin spread like wildfire through the trapping community. Word of the fortification reached nearby outposts, and men began making pilgrimages to see it for themselves. Some were skeptical, questioning the time and expense Samuel had invested in his project, but others were eager to learn from his techniques. Samuel wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He didn't care about becoming a legend. He simply wanted to ensure that the lessons he had learned from tragedy would never be forgotten. And so he began to share his knowledge, teaching others how to build with the same techniques he had perfected: the pinning of logs, the clay horsehair resin chinking, the reinforced door with its secret lock. Despite the admiration from some, there were others who scoffed at his excessive methods. They saw no need for such fortifications, believing that the risks were simply part of the life they led. But Samuel knew better. He knew that the mountains could take anything from you: your life, your livelihood, or the lives of those you loved. If a better way to survive existed, then it was worth the sacrifice. Years passed, and the wilderness continued to challenge Samuel and his cabin. The storms came and went, and Samuel's cabin stood resilient through it all. Though many trappers eventually moved westward as the fur trade declined, Samuel's cabin and his techniques became a lasting legacy in the mountains. Settlers passing through the area, looking for shelter, would often find themselves at the door of what had come to be known as Bridger cabins. Samuel never sought recognition, but as time went on, the term Bridger-style cabins became synonymous with strength and durability. His simple, effective designs saved lives, with countless stories of men surviving dangerous bear attacks or blizzards because of the techniques Samuel had shared. He didn't need accolades. His cabin, his legacy, was enough. It was a testament to what could be accomplished through innovation, determination, and the will to survive in the unforgiving wilds of the Rocky Mountains. As the years turned into decades, Samuel watched as the world around him changed. New generations came, new challenges arose, but the fortress he had built stood firm, a quiet monument to the strength of the human spirit. He had found peace, not just in the protection his cabin provided, but in the knowledge that his story and the lessons learned in the wilderness would live on long after he was gone. The mountains had claimed many lives, but Samuel Bridger's legacy was carved into the land. solid and unyielding, like the very cabin he had built. As the years slipped by and Samuel's hair turned silver, he found himself increasingly reflective on the life he had led. The mountains, once a relentless, imposing force in his youth, had become a familiar companion. The harsh winds, the biting cold, and the weight of each storm had worn him down, but the lessons of survival and innovation had shaped him into a man who understood the land in ways few others could. What began as a fight for survival had transformed into a quiet acceptance of his place in the wilderness, and, in a way, his legacy had grown beyond the walls of his cabin. The traps and furs that once occupied his thoughts were now secondary to the maintenance of his fortress. Samuel spent his days repairing the chinking between the logs and reinforcing his cabin, not because the wilderness was kinder, but because he had come to view the cabin as more than just shelter. It was his life's work. It represented not only the survival of a man, but the preservation of a principle, a philosophy that knowledge and innovation could stand in the face of overwhelming odds. As time passed, more and more people came to the area. Trappers, settlers, and even curious passers-by all sought out Samuel's cabin to witness firsthand the structure that had withstood so much. Some questioned the need for such a fortress, while others marveled at it. Despite the occasional skepticism, Samuel saw it as a quiet victory. His obsession with survival had turned into a lasting symbol of foresight and strength. One particularly cold winter, a young trapper named William Marshall came seeking help. His own cabin had been torn apart by a grizzly during a snowstorm, and he barely escaped with his life. Samuel welcomed him in, sharing a meal and stories of survival by the fire. As William sat there listening to the crackling of the flames and the wind howling outside, Samuel knew this young man was not unlike himself in his earlier days, full of ambition, yet unaware of how brutal the wilderness could be. "You'll have to rebuild, William," Samuel said, his voice steady. "But when you do, I'd recommend using some of the things I've learned. The wilderness doesn't offer many chances." William nodded, his face reflecting both gratitude and awe. "I'll never forget what you've done here. You've built more than a cabin. You've built something that saves lives." For Samuel, it was one of the rare moments when he truly realized the scope of his actions. His cabin, his innovation, was no longer just for him. It had grown into something larger than a single-man survival. It had become part of the culture of the frontier. It was a symbol that survival was not just about skill, but about adapting, learning, and never settling for mere existence. As the years turned into decades, Samuel's health began to decline. The bitter winters, the long seasons of hard labor, and the isolation of the wilderness had taken their toll on him. But through it all, he continued to work on his cabin, ensuring that it remained strong and sturdy, a testament to his life's work. In his final years, Samuel's thoughts often returned to the memory of John Hoffman, the man who had died all those years ago, sparking the obsession that led to the creation of the fortress he now lived in. John's death had not only changed Samuel's life, it had shaped the very way he approached survival in the mountains. The loss was still a wound, but it had also been the catalyst for Samuel's greatest achievement. As the mountains grew quieter with the passing seasons, Samuel Bridger knew that his time was drawing near. But his legacy would not be forgotten. His cabin would remain, standing tall and unyielding in the face of nature's wrath. He had built it to survive the wilderness, but in the process, he had also built something that would survive time itself. It was a quiet morning when Samuel Bridger finally passed from this world. The wind was still, and the sky was a pale gray, as though the mountains themselves were paying their respects to the man who had lived among them for so long. His passing was not dramatic. There were no final battles, no last-minute triumphs, but rather a soft fade into the quiet of the wilderness that had always been his home. He died the way he had lived, unnoticed by the world, but known intimately by the land he had learned to conquer. Samuel had not been alone in his final days. The cabin, his fortress, had become more than just a shelter. It had become a refuge for others as well. Trappers, settlers, and travelers found solace there, drawn not just by the protection it offered, but by the spirit of the man who had built it. When he had built the cabin, he had never intended for it to become a gathering place, but over the years, it had taken on a life of its own, just as Samuel had. And in those last months, when Samuel could no longer work as he had in his youth, it was the people who visited him who offered him comfort, much as he had offered it to others in their time of need. His final day was peaceful. He had spent the morning tending the fire, mending the cracks in the chinking, and making sure the door was secure. As the sun dipped low, he sat down by the hearth, the flickering flames casting a warm glow on his weathered face. He closed his eyes, resting for what he knew would be the last time. Samuel Bridger's death, though not a public affair, marked the end of an era. The fur trade had long since declined, and the days of the mountain man were coming to an end. But Samuel's legacy lived on, not just in the rugged mountains where his cabin still stood, but in the hearts and memories of those who had learned from him. He had given the world more than just a cabin. He had given it a lesson in survival, in perseverance, and in the power of one man's determination to stand against the odds. As word of his passing spread, a handful of trappers and settlers made their way to the cabin to pay their respects. But the cabin was empty now, save for the echoes of Samuel's life and work. His family, who had long since moved to Oregon, were not there to mourn him in the way that he had lived, alone in the mountains. But his story was known. It would be remembered. The cabin, just as Samuel had designed it, stood strong against the elements. Its walls held the knowledge of a man who had never accepted the limitations of the wilderness. The door, the roof, the corners, all were intact, just as Samuel had left them. His final gift to the world was the survival of his fortress, a silent monument to the life he had led. In the years that followed, the name Bridger became synonymous with endurance and resilience. The term Bridger cabin passed into common usage, adopted by countless men and women who understood the value of Samuel's innovation. The cabins became known for their durability, their ability to withstand the forces of nature that so often claimed the lives of those who ventured into the wild. Samuel's legacy did not end with his death. It lived on in the homes built from his ideas, in the hearts of those who survived because of him, and in the mountains where he had once fought so desperately to stay alive. Samuel Bridger had been a mountain man, a trapper, a builder, but most of all, he had been a man who understood that survival wasn't just about brute force. It was about using the mind to outlast the wilderness. And in that, Samuel had succeeded. The wilderness may have claimed his life, but it would never erase the mark he left upon it.